See if this works. Good afternoon. I am going to talk to you a little bit about gearing up for your discussion for Unit 3. Um, and the discussion question talks about the difference between, or like asks you to make a choice between urban, suburban, and rural living. And I'll make sure you have some perspective on that. This is really simple and go through this really quick. Um, but yeah, there it goes. Okay, so where we live, urban, suburban, and rural. In Idaho, we get to experience all of these types of living, or you have the opportunity to experience all these types of living. Where I used to live in Alaska, um, I lived in an urban area in Anchorage, and there was like Anchorage is different because you sort of like there isn't really suburban. There's the city, but it's kind of sprawling anyways, and then it gets rural really, really quick. So even though technically where I grew up was part of the city, it was probably almost rural. We lived on almost an acre plot and had bears walking through my yard, but we're 15 minutes from the city. Um, but it was all in the city still. So it's unique. So some places are more unique than others. But we definitely see this in the Treasure Valley, this urban, suburban, and rural living pretty close to each other. Next slide. Urban areas. Simply put, oh, I'm covering up my city picture. Simply put, an urban area is a city, big city. This is a big city. This is New York. Place with lots of people, traffic, and buildings. And the U.S. urban areas are defined as a population of more than 1,000 people per block of area. Um, that might be a little. I don't know. I live in Boise. I, there's not 1,000 people in my block, but I'm definitely in the city. I mean, there's house there, house there. I'm looking out the windows. There's house back there. But and there's 200,000 people in this little area here. Um, so it's definitely a city, but I don't think there's 1,000 people that live in a block in downtown or work in a block. But so that's kind of relative. Oh, let's go to my next one. Suburban area. Wait, oh wait. Here's advantages and disadvantages of living in an urban area. So these are pretty obvious. I mean, you can think of these kinds of things. Well, God dang it. Higher wages, but usually a higher cost of living. And so people that live in cities usually make more money, and that's typically because it costs more to live there. Man, there's a lot of stuff to do when you live in a city, but it can be more noisy, right? And some of that is there's a lot of places to live, but oftentimes you're in tall high rises, and we're talking about big cities. You're in tall high rises, tall apartment buildings. Hey, I live on the 44th floor, things like that. But it's full of people. And then the great thing about city living is one of my favorite things is all the different types of people you get to meet. Okay, but sometimes there's a lot of those people around, and it gets super duper busy. Suburban area. When I first moved here, we lived in Meridian, and that is definitely a suburb. It's sprawling. This is actually a picture of Meridian. And you can see houses all over. I don't know where in Meridian this is. It says it was a picture of it, the good old internet. But it's definitely a suburb of downtown Boise. It's about 10 minutes away, right? 10, 15 minutes away from right in the heart of downtown, gets you right into the heart of Meridian. Um, and it's just houses and old farmland and more houses and construction and all that stuff, but it's sprawl. These neighborhoods, these cookie cutter type homes, houses all look very similar. A lot of them have pools. There's schools mixed in and around there, and churches, and then and all the houses have yards, and a lot of them have pools or pools in the neighborhood. A lot of people live in suburbs, but it's less crowded. Everybody's spread out. Some of the pros and cons. You kind of get a small town feel, but you're still close enough to the city that you can get to specific things. And a con, I suppose, is that everyone knows your business. Everyone in your neighborhood knows what's going on. Um, they're walkable communities, lots of sidewalks you can get around and stuff. But that distance that they spread out often means that people have to travel farther to get to work, whether it's within that suburb, which is a lot of the cases here, but in some cities around the country, you'll live somewhere and drive into the city for work or take a train into the city for work or things like that. And they are definitely more spread out, like I've said a few times, and more space. And then oftentimes, which it could be a con, I think sometimes to have like you'll just be like right in the middle of your little neighborhood. There's a gas station and a grocery store. I mean, maybe that's not a con, but for some people mixing in that business and retail, they don't want to be that close to stores and things like that, especially if you live on a neighborhood and then they decide to build a Costco right next to your house. I mean, Costco brings in a lot of energy, a lot of traffic, and so a lot of people aren't fond of that part of suburban living. Um, this is a little fuzzy sometimes, but particularly in some suburban areas, you'll get less bureaucracy. You'll get smaller levels of government. Um, but sometimes that means less services and less access to services. Maybe there's not as much recycling available. Maybe the service is a little bit different. Trash pickup, utilities, things like that. But as time goes on, more and more of those services are available. So you don't really miss much living in suburbia than you do in the city, except for those specific things that are unique to city life versus like I'm 10 minutes on a bike from the middle of downtown. So I'm practically in downtown. Um, in the city, when I lived in Meridian, I didn't even go to Boise, and I missed out on all that. So now you can go rural, like what Notice is good example. It's pretty close to Boise, right? About 35 minutes, I think, but it's rural. If you live out there, you probably have a farm, really large space. You can kind of see this little picture here. Like there's a house in here. And there's houses back in these little areas. Usually, these little tree clumps are oftentimes houses, and then all this land around them and the roads and stuff to get to them. They're often farmlands, smaller towns and communities. Not many buildings and not very crowded. Um, Rural areas are often defined as areas with fewer than 2,500 residents total in the whole area. Um, Again, those are general descriptions. They may or may not. They might be a little more, might be a little less, but you get the idea. Rural living. I'll give you an example. Living in a rural quote unquote area in Alaska. Um, I mean, we had snow machines like as kids and snowmobiles, you call them down here, but we drove them around the neighborhood. We had four wheelers. We had, we had a lot. We had toys. In some areas of the country, you can have gardens and farms when you're out there living. You can have more than just cats and dogs. You can have llamas, like our neighbor had. You can have sled dogs. Some lady person in the neighborhood had. Sometimes it's cheaper to live there, and the air is clean, and usually it's more quiet. It can get lonely in a rural area. Not where I was living because we were actually in neighborhoods. They were just big spread out neighborhoods, but rural living can be lonely, and usually you're a longer way from essential services like fire, police, hospitals, schools are sometimes spread out. There's not a lot to do unless you really like living in, outdoor living is fun, and rural living, and you camp in your backyard and go fishing and hunting and things like that. Sometimes it right really close, but the city type or the more urban or suburban type of things that you might want to do. Going shopping is more difficult, although Amazon has changed that, hasn't it? But your access to things like the internet and sometimes other types of utilities or services can sometimes be limited. And that depends on how rural you are and how far that stuff is spread out. And then there's always the idea of the wildlife in your backyard. So, like I said, we used to have bears and moose in our yard in Alaska. So, that there's always that going out to start your car in the morning on a winter day and having a moose right behind it. That's fun stuff. So, for your discussion question coming up, I want you to think about which area you would most want to live in. And maybe you live in an area now and you want to live in somewhere else. Or maybe you love where you live. And so you're going to be ready to explain why you choose that area and give evidence, specific evidence to support your choice. And it can be part from this slideshow, but other things. Think about the other things that are specific to where or what you might want to live, the type of place you might want to live in, and go from there. All right. As always, any questions, give me a shout. Good luck.